Hello, everybody. Shall we get started? I'm half wanting to get you all to kind of cluster in the middle because there's loads of us in here, but lots of empty seats. Does anybody want to fill in the centre? No, you don't, do you? You just want to sit on there. Oh, very good, fantastic. Entirely up to you whether you want to fill in on the centre. If you want to stay on the wings, that's fine. You will have a less good view of our speakers from there because they will be just here. There's plenty of room on the front row. Those seats are not reserved for anybody. So you're very welcome. Anyway, welcome to, I can't remember how many of these things we've done before. We used to say our first, second, third, fourth, fifth Noisy Thinking. This is our 9th Noisy Thinking, so welcome to our 9th Noisy Thinking. Those of you who haven't seen me do this before, my name is Craig. I'm Joint Chief Strategy Officer at AMV, but also Chair of the APG. So these events are possible thanks to the help of Google in helping us with venues every so often, and also thanks to the generous support of Flamingo, who you will hear more of later because we have one of their people speaking this evening, which is fantastic. You will hear 3 very provocative and different points of view. I'm very pleased to see that the topic of research is still one which is getting planners out in their droves. Unless the only people here all work for Flamingo. I'm not going to get you to raise your hands if you work for Flamingo. That would just be embarrassing for Kirsty. So we shan't do that. And also here on a sunny evening as well, which is brilliant. It shows good fortitude for the craft of planning rather than standing outside a pub drinking white wine, which is good, which is also part of the craft of planning, as we all know. We will hear 3 speakers, each of whom will speak for around about 20 minutes each. If you have any questions, then write them down or note them down on your iPhone, and we'll get everybody back up to answer questions at the end. There's a rather intimidating online stopwatch.com over there, which we've never had before, but I'm quite excited about. That will be particularly distracting and worrying for our speakers. But we have 3 fantastic speakers this evening. So first of all, we'll hear from John Griffiths. John has been a planner in pretty much every type of agency you can imagine. So began in what we used to call ad agencies back in the old days. We're not allowed to say ad anymore. And then has worked his way through direct agencies, digital agencies, design agencies, pretty much any kind of agency you would think of, and then finds himself now creative director of Spring Research. So brings a particularly fresh perspective to the idea of research, but particularly a planner's perspective to the idea of research. So he will begin. After John, we have Wendy Gordon, who surely needs no introduction to anybody who knows anything about research. Wendy has largely invented large parts of what we know excellent qual research to be about nowadays, and has founded and now runs, she's founded a range of research companies over the years, but currently runs her latest company that she has founded, Acacia Avenue, who provide excellent qualitative research to ad agencies all over town, particularly good at creative development, I may add. Very happy with working with them. And finally, Kirsty Fuller from Flamingo, who, as I say, have supported us throughout our Noisy Thinking series. This wouldn't have been possible, certainly not at these bargain prices. It would not have been possible without them. And she will round off. So she was also founder of a seminal research company and continues to be the person running that research company. So started Flamingo and continues Flamingo. Flamingo also, I could highly recommend, equally as good as Acacia Avenue, although Flamingo have, of course, made this evening possible. So if you're looking to put some qual research money somewhere, think of the APG at that point. But they're both equally excellent at creative development research, I have to say. So without further ado, I will pop up again later and attempt to sell you a training course which will cover many of the topics you see this evening, and I will also try and persuade those of you who aren't to become members of the APG, but that's all for later. We will begin with John.
Great. Well, good evening, everyone. This far-flung audience here. Forgive me if I pace. I was talking to a planner yesterday about this evening's event, and she said, whenever I think about commissioning research, my mind goes blank. I don't know what to do next. And what I want to talk about this evening in this first session is how we frame the questions to get away from that feeling lost, feeling blank, and saying, where do we go? The thing that planners normally do in response to that is to go on a research course. And that means you then have a list of research techniques or methods that you can use. My belief is that that actually makes it worse because the danger is that you're then using the tail to wag the dog. You're picking a research technique, but you're not necessarily asking the questions up front. So what I'm basically wanting to say today is if you ask the right questions, the research methods, the research approaches will take care of themselves. And if you don't ask the right questions, it really doesn't matter how good the technique or how good the researcher even, you won't get to the best answers. So really I'm wanting to talk about this whole business of the questions and the hypotheses. Now last year, and I promise not to talk about it too much, I started working on a project to talk to the earliest account planners that I could find. I've been working on it with Tracy over at JWT. And it's a bit like kind of going for the source of the Nile, speaking to people who started working in planning about 1962 to 1980 from 3 agencies, mostly, BMP, JWT, and I can reveal the surprise entry, and I'm going to be talking about them a bit, JWT, CDP, because that was an agency which people didn't realize had got a strong planning ethos to it, and that has sort of popped up. Now, one of the things that was said by Stanley Pollitt, one of the founders of account planning, was in an agency, everyone's got an opinion. The difference about a planner is that a planner has to have an informed opinion. It's about evidence. It's not just about being part of the process. It's about knowing what the questions to ask are and finding the evidence to back it up. I like to think of it in terms of hypotheses. Sounds a little bit technical, and it isn't necessarily a scientific hypothesis, but a hypothesis or a working hypothesis is a proposed explanation for what you think is going to happen. And you have to test it before you know it's right. And a lot of the time, because it's a working hypothesis, it's going to be wrong. That's difficult in agencies, because agencies don't like getting things wrong. I've sat next to people in new business who explain that the ethos of the agency is to get it right first time. I don't believe a word of that, because the whole basis of what we're doing is to try things which are risky and to give clients the confidence that something's going to happen because we are testing it, and we make sure we get it right, and we almost never get it right first time. So we're not paid to write briefs, not to read articles about marketing online that we can use at client meetings, but to find evidence that shows that the work that we're developing works and makes a commercial difference. So I said I was going to talk about CDP, and I want to mention the Heineken campaign, refreshes the parts other beers don't reach. Now, most of you weren't even born when this thing went out. But the reason why probably a lot of you know about it is that it's used as an example of how creative development research never works. Because the story goes that it bombed, and therefore people have hypothesized, I use the hypothesis word again, that therefore there's no point in researching creative work, so you may as well just carry on without it because it didn't work in the Heineken example. Fortunately, I've had the privilege of tracking down, among others, the planner that developed that campaign, so I can tell you a bit more about the story of what happened behind it. Firstly, the brand was dying, so Whitbread had to do something drastic. The beer category had been researched to death, and so what they decided to do was to bring in a proposition from outside of the category. Funnily enough, beer isn't refreshing, or it wasn't then. What beer was trying to do, because of the way in which lager was coming in, was to be as masculine as possible, because people weren't really taking lager seriously. So the thing that all the beer brands were doing was to find new ways of rehashing masculinity. Refreshing belongs to iced tea, Pimm's, gin and tonic, stuff nothing to do with beer. So they brought it in. Now, this proposition was written on a card and given to Terry Lovelock. Heineken, refreshment. That was the brief. Now, the advertising idea that they came up with, because this was the thing that CDP did, was supposed to be category busting. And so it showed, the first example being the policeman's feet, I'm just going to show you in a second, showing people in absurd and extreme situations. Can we see it now?
In this simple experiment, we examine the effect of beer on the feet. Now, these feet have been walking all day and are very tired. We see that there is no movement in them, which is due to lack of refreshment. So we administer the cold Heineken. Wait a few seconds, and we observe that the Heineken is already refreshing the feet, causing lively movements of the toes and activating the arches. Heineken is the only beer able to do this, because it refreshes the parts other beers cannot read.
Genius. Advertising history. It bombed. It bombed because no one had seen anything like it before. It didn't look like beer advertising. And as David Clifford, the planner, said, the thing you should research is asking people what they know about. They know about beer, they know about what's refreshing, but they don't know about advertising they've never ever seen before. They're not confident or competent to talk about it. So you think they researched it? Of course they did, because nervous clients insist on research because they want to know that something's going to happen. So they researched it, and as I said, it bombed in creative development. But Frank Lowe and the marketing manager, Tony Simmons-Gooding, kept the campaign from being junked. And out it went. How do you think it did? Terribly. The first survey they got coming back from the campaign showed that people couldn't make head or tail of it. And then something quite unexpected happened. The miners' strike. Now, what happened with the miners' strike was that because a whole lot of people were out of work and beer sales were going to go south very quickly because no one could afford to buy beer, suddenly airtime became very cheap because all the brand owners started pulling out. So CDP had a crisis meeting. What were they going to do? It was a great opportunity just to call it a day and leave. But they didn't do that. What they did was to suggest that with prices falling on airtime, they should therefore stay in and get more airtime to exploit the share of voice. And miners who couldn't afford beer, but did have the time to sit around and talk about funny ads with policemen's feet, had the time to change their opinion. And that was the story of how the campaign came to succeed. Now, why have I told you that story? Well, to show how persistence and a lot of good luck can lead to great campaigns. But research was integral to Heineken's success. Do you really expect that a client would take a proposition from outside of the category and bring it inside the category with no evidence whatsoever that it was going to work? Research was important, and even CDP couldn't suggest that you could run their brilliant work without evidence. So what they would do is they would test the propositions and then get the client to buy the proposition. If the client turned down the work from that proposition, CDP would fire the client, and they did it more than once. That was part of the legend of CDP. You may find that hard to believe, but it happened more than once. So what I want to do is to give you 10 questions to get you started on your hypothesis generation. And just watch how research flows out of them. So I'm going to have to go very quick because of time. 1, culture. An overused word these days, but what we're so used to doing that we don't notice is worthy of study. Nudge, nudge. I shouldn't have to explain this to you. Now, the giveaway is the phrase, you know. Whenever in research people start saying, you know, it's because they're saying, we all agree on this. We all collude where culture is concerned, but the solution is to think like an alien. Get a man to understand makeup. Get those without kids to understand parenting. Become an outsider and think like an outsider. A great way to generate hypotheses. 2, the market category is usually a conspiracy between brands who share their employees, business models, and most of their brand benefits. And marketers spend 90% of their time trying to prove that these brands are actually different from each other, when virtually the processes by which those brands operate are very, very similar. So hypothesize, what are the norms of the category, and which of them can your brand break, and should it break? 3, what are the key numbers driving usage and consumption? How many people are eating cereal in London this evening? 5,000? 50,000? 500,000? Put numbers on everything, and it will make you curious to find out what the actual numbers are. The convention is that qualitative is fluffy and quantitative is hard. Nonsense. Numbers are abstractions. There are false positives, false negatives, and standard error. Numbers are as fluffy as the fluffiest customer quotations. So use them qualitatively, and you will learn loads. Most of your assumptions are wildly out because your working hypotheses are wrong, but you'll do better the next time around. 4, pay attention to behavior or use the product yourself. Our bodies are brilliant learning and memorizing tools, so efficient that most of it gets stored without alerting your conscious mind. Do you have a model for how ordinary people buy and use the products that you're working on? Go and get one. 5, what are the heuristics operating in the market? Heuristics are just shorthand routines, thought patterns or behavior patterns, which people use to make fast decisions or just to avoid thinking too hard. Find out what they are. Do you think people behave rationally? Of course they don't. Now, Wendy, I'm sure, will be talking about this in a little bit. 6, how do customers perceive the brand? Pay attention. Not how do brand owners wish that customers perceive the brand, but how do they actually perceive it? Half the things that people think about brands were never ever put there by the marketing team. And these brand dimensions can be plain wrong with no basis in fact, but people still believe them. And that can be very useful. So let's find those too. 7, do you have a model for how communication works? Now, it's been a very long time since planner Mike Hall had his eureka moment and jumped out of the bath at the Grand Hotel Brighton. This is absolutely true. And gave a presentation the next day saying there's only 4 ways advertising works. And this insight drove his company, Hall & Partners, to the top of the research leagues. And every time you talk to someone from Hall & Partners, they'd say to you, so what's your model for how the advertising is going to work? And if you didn't know, they'd say, well, we'll come back when you do have one. Or would you like us to help you do it? So here are the 4. 1, the salience strategy. Is the advertising talking about itself in a way which gets people talking? In other words, the advertising is at least as famous as the product. 2, persuasion. Is there something you're trying to teach where you're just trying to knock it into someone's skull through repetition? 3, affinity. Does it create emotion? Is there a sense of humor, something which makes people feel close to it? 4, is there a call to action? Now, I'm not saying those are all the models, but it was great having more than one, or having a single questionnaire which somehow covered all the things that advertising might, or the way it could possibly work. 8, what impact does context have? Now, Spring Research, where I've been working, has done a lot of work on this in the last year, but so are a lot of other research agencies. It's really one of the hot topics this year. Did you know that depending on context, people say and do very different things? Of course you knew that. Did you know that people give different answers in research depending on where they are when you ask them the question? Ah, yes, something to think about. So looking at the impact of context is really important, and now we have mobile phones. We have ways of exploring context that we didn't have a couple of years ago. 9, what mistakes or misunderstandings do marketers commit regularly in understanding what motivates their customers? What mistakes have you made recently? If you haven't made any, then you haven't been trying hard enough. Make hypotheses big enough so that they're mostly right or wildly wrong. Make tiny mistakes and you'll never learn anything. 10, when people buy or use a product a lot, do they A, switch on to automatic pilot, B, become promiscuous, or C, fall in love with the brand and bang on about it all the time? Note, they can't do all 3 of those things, but which is more relevant to the brand that you're working on? That's it. That's the 10. There's loads more. I just dumped 10 as ways of getting started, but I'm sure you can think of many more. But here's the thing, you can't answer any of those 10 hypothesis starting questions without recourse to some kind of research. And that is where research comes from asking vital questions that you don't know the answers to. You may not always need research, but of all the ways to find out, research is usually the easiest and most accessible, and that's why it continues to be important. Planning was invented to protect agencies from the fearful, because clients are often fearful and they need reassurance to do things which are outside of their comfort zone. The fearful, the lazy, and the frankly deluded. If you work with people who think that because they're so brilliant that they don't need to test anything, then you can ask them on what basis they've got that confidence. If it's basically because they think they're right and they're backing up their own idea, I suggest you'll find them firmly in the delusion camp. There's lots of good people in our agencies, but no one is that good. I want to tell you something that I doubt no one else will tell you. Planning isn't for life. Your ability to stay in this business and to add value derives almost entirely from your ability to ask good questions, generate sound working hypotheses, and to go and frame the evidence and go and get it. The instant your planning directors find someone younger and cheaper than you who asks just as good questions, your days will be numbered. It's great to be brainy. It's great to have a job that demands creativity and intelligence. The catch is that your cleverness needs to rise faster than your salary, and in reality, it almost never does. Why am I depressing you with this? Remember that kid who sat in class next to you and went off and learned a trade? I hope some of you went to schools where people did that. 30 years on, and they'll be earning as much as you are, if not more. Because if you do a few things well, and you build your client base, and you build a business, you can make a good living out of that. The risk that we take is doing a job which has so much variety in it that every single project feels like a new one. If you learn to ask good questions, and you keep on learning, then I promise you that even if you're not a planner in 30 years' time, you will still be using the same skills. Clients will seek you out. You will light up the room, and I'm sure all of you have experience of seeing senior planners work and just going, how do they do that? I didn't even see the speed, and the surprise with which they will come to the conclusions they do. Because the ability to sit down without so much as a pen and paper and to ask questions and develop hypotheses that can change the direction of a business within weeks is magical. And that's what we do. In summary, can I suggest that you don't use research like a slab of carbohydrate slammed down on the plate next to the creative, because that's what everyone else does and what everyone else is expecting. You should learn to cook yourself. A few basic dishes, well done, with a few simple ingredients. Fresh. We should be able to do this and not just buy research in. And of course, as Craig was saying, the APG runs courses for you to learn how to do that. But I suggest it's learning to do it yourself, not just to come out with a list of methods to try and get you out of a jam. Secondly, develop a taste for fine food and eating out. Find out who the great chefs are, the ones who run the great kitchens, who can do extraordinary things to understand what motivates human beings. Why do you think I'm here this evening? So I can be on the same bill as Wendy Gordon, for goodness sake. She ran the course that I went on 27 years ago, and she's at the top of the business then, and she still is now. Flamingo Research have consistently produced really interesting work. I've used their case studies when I've taught MBAs about online research. Now we have the privilege of working in a city which is one of the world's great centers of research, and we have some of the greatest practitioners here. For goodness sake, use it. We won't just do research for you, we can help you think, and that's basically the offer that we want to put to you this evening. Thanks very much.
He blew my age. I thought at least I'd get away with being 40. Noisy thinking, I just love this idea. And I was incredibly flattered when Craig asked me to talk tonight. But I'm hugely in awe of the real noisy thinkers, like Rory, Mark Earls, Russell, John Kieran, I'm sure you know them all, and even John Griffiths. He's a really noisy thinker. Me, on the other hand, I'm a bit of a quiet thinker. And my request to you tonight is to take away something from what I'm saying into your working lives. And at some time when you're next involved with research, take a few moments and reflect. And maybe some of the things that I've said might sort of run through your head. So, as Sir John kindly said, all those people he talked about in the late 60s was when I got into working with agencies. So I've been around for some time working with planners, with agencies, and with clients. And I have to tell you that the good old days were a bit of a myth. The holy grail of best practice was very elusive 4 decades ago, 3 decades ago, 2 decades ago, and it's still elusive even now. And I find this really surprising because you planners or researchers that are here now are more informed nowadays than ever before. There have been so many conferences and papers, from people like Robert Heath and Paul Feldwick about how advertising or communications really work. You've learned, I'm sure, about neuroscience and how we absorb stuff in our brains and how memory works. You know about the influence of culture. You'll definitely know about herd theory. And I'm sure that you know about some of the principles of behavioral economics. Or if you don't, you really should. So it's a puzzle. Why is research often so painful? And fundamentally, I believe that it's a human being problem. Planners, like researchers, like all human beings, are completely unaware of the cognitive, emotional, or social biases that influence your own decisions. And that's why I think that planners get the research they deserve. We all human beings, I'm going to say we a lot because I'm actually putting myself in the same position as planners or researchers or human beings. So I mean we, all of us. We all make good enough decisions most of the time. And mostly things turn out okay, and in fact quite good sometimes. That's what gives you confidence. But too often, the outcome is less than optimal. And this is because of the law of least effort. We human beings tend to substitute easy decisions for more difficult ones. We believe our reasons why. We don't interrogate our decisions, just as John was inferring, and we don't find the evidence really to support something that we think we should do. We tend to jump to conclusions. So I'm going to explore a little why this might be happening, and I'm going to start with 4 examples. And actually, having thought of these 4 examples, I realized that I'd fallen into a classic behavioral economics bias, which is the availability bias, for those of you that know anything about this. So the first example is really one of those times where you've got 3 routes and 3 to 4 executions in each route. And the method of choice is to go into standard focus groups. 6 focus groups or 4 focus groups. Everybody pitches up for the first group. About half who are supposed to be there stay for the second group, and the rest get done in Manchester. The final scripts arrive, at the researchers or at my house or one of us houses at 8 p.m. the night before. The stimulus material is either non-existent, sorry, we couldn't get it together, or marginally helpful. It is helpful sometimes. The next day, there are last-minute tweaks to the guide. There's words and secrets in the researcher. Yeah, can I just talk to you a moment before the group starts? Lots of tension happens during the field work. And what's the result? It's hit and miss. Happily hit sometimes, but often a miss. And what's happening here is too easy, facile decision-making, that assumptive decision-making that's ended up in a situation like that. That's the first example. The next one I call snail. This is a painfully slow development of a global print campaign. Believe me, we've experienced it. And we call it the J&D problem, just noticeable differences. 4 executions with just noticeable differences. You can say it's A versus A, and A versus A versus A versus A versus maybe even A, that kind of thing. So individual interviews are decided upon across 3 continents simultaneously over 2 nights. 24 hours later, the top line is delivered. And what happens then are sort of improvements and tweaks and things go on, which actually as a researcher you don't really know what's going on. And then finally you get a call again, we'd like to repeat the whole thing. And so all the stuff comes back again. And this can happen twice or 3 times. I kid you not. So the outcome of this sort of process is often acceptable advertising. But everybody's really just relieved that you've got to the end of the process. But very few, I would imagine, are incredibly proud of the output. That's the second one. The third is this brave, creative idea. A number of executions around a solid core of thinking. And what happens, during the work is, that there's a sort of dramatic, emotional, and spontaneous response to some of the executions. In fact, the participants in the research are falling about laughing. They're exchanging stories. They're saying that it's great. So the researcher is confident at the debrief, tells the client and the agency that the creative idea is engaging and it builds positive associations for the brand, and one of the executions is incredibly strong. After the qualitative research, the client and the agency, unbeknownst to the researcher, decide to add in a 20-second or 10-second promotional offer to the actual ad, right? It then goes off for pre-testing, bombs, and all sorts of blame stuff happens after that. So, something's going on here, an assumption that happened about, that if it worked like this, we can just add to it, and it's still going to work to this, again. And the fourth example is the kind of situation where multifaceted issues face the brand. And the campaign is attempting to deal with all of them across various executions or media or so on. And what happens during the work, and it doesn't really matter, as John said, which methodology people were using, it turns out that the foundational understanding of the consumer relationship to the brand is either out of date or very skimpy. So the outcome of this sort of process is that everybody has a different point of view. The agency draws different conclusions from the client. The researchers draw perhaps different or the same as one or other of them. And again, it ends up with a lot of tension. So I have drawn on 4 examples that we've experienced. I suppose what doesn't come into my head are all the many times when creative development research has gone really, really well. It's across media, the stimulus material's been great, the planner's been brilliant, the client's been accepting. But I'm sort of talking about things that happen often enough for me to want to raise them tonight. And I don't know afterwards whether any of you would identify with any of those situations. So what's happening here really is that, as we know, uncertainty is a dominant fact of business life today. And within this context, developing great communication is complex. It's unpredictable, it's confusing, it's challenging. And uncertainty at all levels, whether it's about the actual thinking part, the hypothesis generation, the questions, whether you're uncertain at emotional level because you're feeling sort of exposed in your team, whatever. There are lots of issues that are uncertain during this process. So they could be about the team, it could be in the agency culture, it could be the relationship between the agency and the client, it could be amongst your peer group, it could be just be the effect of the recession that's created this incredible pressure. And what happens in this sort of situation, that biases are very common. The more stressful the situation, the more complex, the more likely we are to make decisions that are not necessarily optimum. So I'm going to look at 5 of them and try and work out perhaps. What I'm going to ask you to reflect upon is if you can identify in yourselves any of the times that you might have fallen or been in this sort of bias, as we call them, or erroneous thing. I'm sure you're familiar with this great classic sort of advertising for Nike in the States. You don't win silver, you lose gold. I mean, this is classic loss aversion. And all human beings fear loss, whether it's social loss, whether it's financial loss, whether it's something to do with your identity, who you see yourself to be. People fear loss far more than they crave gain. In fact, it's been shown that people across, are that loss is twice as emotionally impactful than the potential gain that one might receive. So what the response to an idea or a feeling or an anticipation of loss is to stay put, to actually just keep the status quo as it is. And therefore you choose the familiar, the unchallenging, whatever. And this, I think, is one of the main reasons why so much research is conservative and risk-averse. And if you think about it, a sure gain of 4 group discussions is better than a risky gamble on some of the things that John was suggesting that you do. Much more innovative, much more accelerated learning, much freer kind of questioning and searching for evidence. So the rationalizations or the signs of loss aversion are always rationalizations. When you hear things like, oh, there's no time to do anything else, the client won't play ball with this, it's untried or it's too risky, it's too expensive, or perhaps this is too cheap, or it takes too long, those kinds of reasons are really clues to the fact that loss aversion somewhere is going on, either within yourself, within your team, or with the client. The next one is social proof. Let's give you a moment to have a look at that. I don't know if you can see it. But anyway, when you're unsure, you're much more likely to follow the lead of others, especially if they're like-minded. And it's hard to be the doubting Thomas if everyone else is enthusiastic and up for the particular campaign or idea or whatever it is that the researcher's being involved about. And this is compounded by the tendency to believe in a perceived authority. I mean, this could be somebody more experienced than yourself. It could be the client. It could be the creative director. It could be anybody, really, who you perceive to be in some way more knowledgeable than oneself. And this is one of the other areas where, you know, sometimes less than optimal decisions are made. The third one is about over or underestimating probability. We human beings are incredibly bad at estimating how successful something might be in the future. We either confidently overestimate success or we underestimate the risks. Daniel Kahneman explains this over and over again in Thinking Fast and Slow. And if you haven't read it, I know it's a big book. I really, really recommend that you do. He calls it WYSIATI. I don't know how he pronounces that. But what it stands for is what you see is all there is. And this is what happens to people. We fall for the fallacy of small numbers. We tend to mistake chance associations for cause and effect. We all believe that we know more than we actually do know. We often have an illusion of control. And we believe the compelling narratives we can create. You know, all of this is kind of what happens, which leads to an underestimating of risk or an overestimation of confidence. And I suspect that the Brave Bull example that I talked about might have fallen into this sort of trap. This is one of the fundamental sort of principles of behavioral economics, which is framing. It's how you frame a problem. And how a problem is framed leads to different solutions. So just think about it for a moment. Next time that you are involved in any research at all or discussions about it, how are you or how is anybody else framing it? Is it being framed negatively? Oh God, we just have to do this because it's got to get through. Or is it being framed positively as something that's going to be exciting, that we've got an opportunity to learn something? Is it being framed narrowly, so we're just looking at it in a certain sort of way in a very tight sort of context? Or is it being framed broadly? Is it a default, or is it an adventure? Is it a gain, or is it a loss? All of the ways in which research is talked about and framed will influence how it is done and how successful it might be in helping you with the particular issue that you're dealing with. And the last one I wanted to talk about was confirmation bias, which is something that we researchers experience time and time again. So people tend to look for information that confirms what they know already. And just think about the backroom conversations. You know, often we come back from having done the interview or whatever it is, the focus group, and as we walk into the back room, they all say to us, oh, we didn't learn much that time, did we? So, you know, that's a definite confirmation bias. So enough of all of that. I'm sure that for those of you that are familiar with those biases, I'm just hoping that you might apply them to yourselves rather than just to consumers or to clients or to other people. It's always easier to see in other people than it is to see in oneself. So I thought I'd just show you my holiday photos, actually. Here's one. I've just been to Bhutan, climbed up there. Very proud of myself, I was. But the thing about Bhutan is that there's lots of time for reflection, and also the Bhutanese, being the land of happiness, are very clever about how they relate to each other. And here is an example of nudging in the land of happiness. So I began to think about how planners can use nudges to get better research. Here's one that I think is particularly brilliant. It's just a reminder of a clever nudge. So surely I ask you, are there some clever nudges you can come up with yourselves to get the kind of research you deserve? I'm sure that there are. Here's an example of sort of choice architecture, if you like, and anchors. Think how you present options in terms, perhaps, of costs or time or effort. anchors are relevant here. One group discussion, or perhaps 4 group discussions, is the anchor, the reference point from which judgments of the cost of this research, its value, or perhaps, if it takes a week to do, it's the anchor for time and effort. And I absolutely know that it's completely possible to get clients to do something different if the choice mechanics are thought about. Here's another choice one which I like. Also think how you present options perhaps that the agencies come up with, whether they're routes or executions or whatever it is that whatever area of communications you work in. How do you present the options both to the clients and eventually to consumers? When we judge something in isolation, we're far less sensitive to details than when we are able to compare different things. So what happens when you have too many routes and too many executions? It leads to spurious responses. And I don't believe that research design is thought hard enough about, before people really go into it. So this is my second to last slide. At the end of Thinking Fast and Slow, Kahneman asks himself how much he is able to influence his own decisions based on all his 30 years of experience of experimentation. And he says, my intuitive thinking is just as prone to overconfidence, extreme predictions, and the planning fallacy as it was before I made a study of these issues. I have improved only in my ability to recognize situations in which errors are likely to occur. For example, this number might be an anchor, or this decision will be different if the problem is reframed. So his answer to himself is to recognize the signs that are in a potential minefield, a cognitive minefield, a social minefield, an emotional minefield, and slow down. And that's what I meant about a time for reflection. And perhaps you can ask a fellow like-minded planner to watch out for you in your decisions. A kind of buddy system, like I'm thinking of doing this, challenge me. Or get your planning department together and brainstorm ways to counteract the biases, or to perhaps develop a series of nudges that could be really useful. Conduct post-mortems after a piece of work and learn from them. And develop a shared language. It's helpful if you can talk about loss aversion, even in a joke, or narrow framing, or the overconfidence bias. Once it's named, it can bring to mind examples and possible remedies. So I'm going to leave you with a choice architecture about. Thank you.
We'll probably know from the fact that Flamingo has been sponsoring these events that we really value relationships with the planning community. I think the success of Flamingo initially had very, very strong relationships, particularly with agencies like BBH and the kind of Levi's, the long-running Levi's campaign. So I think planners, planning, the planning discipline is pretty close to our hearts. And we feel pretty invested in it, which I guess is one of the reasons why we're here and taking part. And when I looked at the title of this evening, I was really torn. Actually, I was torn about what to say, what side to fall on. Where should I be? I'm torn because I'm quite wary. I have to say, of the negative stereotype of the research industry. So what I really want to say is, planners get the research they deserve. I want to say yes and no. And I can almost see you planners wanting to roll your eyes and say, oh no, it's another one of those researchers. They're going to put up a chart that goes on the one hand and on the other hand. They're going to do a spectrum of temperature of response, and they're going to put positive and negative. They're going to list verbatims that are positive and list verbatims that are negative. And then they're kind of going to say, well, they probably aren't going to say, are they? They're just going to leave it there up on the slide, and you're going to be going, what am I supposed to do with it? What do I do? But nevertheless, I'm going to persevere, because I really think the answer to this question is yes and no. And I want to begin with the no. I want to begin with the no. Planners, I don't think you do get the research you deserve. I'm a bit disheartened sometimes actually about what is being delivered to planners on many occasions. So we've prided ourselves, certainly, and I have, I hope, on positive and strong relationships. There have been lots of great long-term collaborations, but I fear that they're becoming less frequent, those long-term collaborations. I fear that they're more exceptional. You want to talk about them because they are good, because they stand out, because they kind of stand out from the norm. And I feel that at the beginning of each project, each interaction with planners, I feel like I'm having to work harder to gain credibility, to say, actually, I'm your friend, actually, we want to work with you, actually, we want to be all about creating things and generating things and building things. We don't really want to be testing things, deconstructing things, and destroying things. But it's becoming much harder to deliver, I think, our best work to planners in the planning community. And much of, I think, the best work is now being reserved for work commissioned directly with clients, with less involvement and influence from planners. So that means that planners are not getting the research that they deserve, or maybe planning's not getting the research that it deserves. But the issue goes beyond planners as individuals, I think. It goes to the structure and the demands of clients and agencies themselves. But I think that we have relationship issues. I think we've got relationship issues. I think planners and researchers have some relationship issues. And that's having a very negative effect. And I think you deserve better. I think you do deserve better. I think you deserve better from the research and insight industry. I think that the value of research, the perceived value of research amongst planners, I think that's eroding. And I think it's eroding partly because you're not deriving the best value from research. So if you're not getting the best value from research, it just confirms that preconception that actually that value isn't even there to be had. So why is that happening? It's becoming a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. Why is that happening? Let's look at what's behind the deterioration in our relationship with a view to taking positive action, with a view to saying, well, actually, how do we start to generate more positive relationships that I think last over time? I mean, that is assuming that you're as committed to doing that as we are. So do you believe in this relationship? Are you committed to making this relationship work harder? Are you willing to do what it takes to put it right? And I think that takes effort from both sides. Now, I'll say first things first. I am willing to take some flack on behalf of our industry. I think there are some researchers out there whose strength, quite frankly, does not lie in interrogating, understanding, and building creative ideas. They don't have a sensitivity, a respect, a love for the creative process. They probably shouldn't be anywhere near your work. They probably shouldn't be anywhere near your creatives. And if that is your experience of research as a planner, then my sympathy is with you, because you do deserve better. But there are things that we can do to put that right. But I don't believe that that is the main driver of the changed status of the planner-researcher relationship. I don't think it's about the quality of work being delivered. There have always been poor researchers, there have been good researchers, there have been bad researchers, there have been indifferent researchers. It's always been like that. But what is clear, I think, I feel, I see, I experience, that planners have become more distanced. And in some cases, I think, disinterested with the choice of researcher, with the research process, that the knowledge and expertise in choosing the right person for the job, for the work, and developing a strong working relationship over time has actually been decreasing. So you're more likely, I think you're more exposed than you were in the past to experiencing the bad and a little bit less of the good over time. So to this extent, yes, you are getting the research you deserve, because if neither party invests in the relationship, it will wither and it will die. I mean, I think you do seem so distanced. You seem so distant from us. Is there something wrong? What's happening? Because we do need to invest in it on both sides. Otherwise, I think we're not at the moment heading in a positive direction. As Wendy said, I think planners have become the more conservative, risk-averse commissioners of research. We've been talking about framing. I think often planners are entering into a research process with quite limited expectations of what it can deliver, or very clear objectives on the purpose they want it to serve, being more about showing than knowing. And these entry points serve to reconfirm prejudices and make it difficult for any research agency to shine. Planners also can stick with their own kind, gravitating towards agencies of ex-planners who think like they do, which is a very safe, comfortable space to be, but perhaps isn't leading to the challenging, inspirational, kind of eye-opening kind of findings. And I think at the same time as this is happening among the planning community, we're finding that there are more clients, and very senior clients, who are commissioning some amazing work, some really interesting work, who are much more engaged with consumer insight and cultural insight, and that are more demanding of the kind of output, the kind of learning, the kind of sharing that the industry can offer. And I think that often there are prejudices about what research can deliver. I think there are prejudices about what's research output like. Is it a PowerPoint presentation that goes on for a very long time and starts off with objectives and methodology and probably a table with group discussions in it, and you're already nodding off before we've got into the findings? Or are you thinking of curated spaces and exhibitions of a space within the headquarters of Adidas that is there all the time to bring to life the key themes of their target globally, or books and outputs and things that are living on the desks of clients and capturing what the brand is all about, but what the consumer relationship is all about? Research and insight has really moved on. It's really changed. And I'm not convinced that the perceptions of planners in the planning community has moved at the same space. The world of qualitative and cultural insight has moved on. We're integrating more disciplines, be that semiotics, be that mobile ethnography, be that cultural intelligence, be that thinking around behavioral economics, which Wendy's just been talking about. We're recruiting people from very diverse backgrounds, yes, from planning, but we've got ex-clients, we've got documentary makers, we've got designers, we've got journalists. There's a whole range of people coming into the consumer and cultural insight industry. And I think there's a lot more there on offer than perhaps the planning community is regularly accessing. And I'm not sure that the perceptions of value of the planning community are in line with the change within the industry. Whilst I feel progressive planners are kind of shouting at us, come on, get out of your box. Actually, we want you to be more engaged with our organization. We want you to be talking to more senior audiences in our organization. I feel like, and we need more genuinely insightful cultural and consumer understanding to grow our business. I sometimes feel planners are feeling the opposite, and they're almost saying, would you get back in your box? Would you stay where you are? Would you not overstep the mark? And actually just look at this idea and give us some feedback. And as Mark Murray said, the head of global consumer planning at Diageo, and he's a case in point, and his cry is, we want bolder thinking from you as a strategic partner. We want a stronger cultural perspective married with consumer insight. Please don't come to us just suggesting group discussions. We're looking for a much, much broader perspective. And I also feel that, in an era where we're trying to build, in a lot of instances, we're very involved in global brand work and brands being built across very different cultural contexts, very different markets. The need for consumer and cultural understanding has never been greater. You've got clients, agencies, and planners often sitting in London with reference points of Shoreditch and perhaps Brooklyn, And the growth markets for the brands are India, or China, or Russia, or Brazil, and so it goes on, and Indonesia increasingly, and Vietnam. But anyway, all of these markets and cultures and places that are not familiar to us, we can't work on our instincts, we can't live through our own experiences. And we actually need to have a cultural perspective. We need some cultural anchors, we need some consumer anchors. And I think that clients are understanding that perhaps more quickly than the planning community is. But why do we not have a more positive relationship? I think it is because we don't have quality time together. Our time, and Wendy referenced this, often our time together as researchers and planners is in quite a pressurized, difficult context. It's at the point in a process where probably a lot's already been invested in a creative idea and in a campaign idea, and actually we're already through to executions. You've probably already spent 6 months discussing the thing. You're probably at the point where you're like, please, can we get on to actually make something? And the client says, no, we've got research process. And you're probably sitting there going, oh no, we've just got to get it through the research. So the mindset isn't about learning and understanding and all those kinds of things. It's about, can I please get this through? Which puts you into a certain mindset, a mindset which is about protecting the idea at all costs, only hearing the things you want to hear, grabbing the things that support the idea, grabbing the things that say we can go on to make this execution, trying to screen out everything else, not wanting to hear about cultural issues and problems and context. And that's a very, very difficult context in which to develop a positive relationship, because it's stressful. You're under stress. You end up using research in a particular way to confirm everything that you just want to hear. And it's almost like your first meeting with the planner. The chat-up line is, this relationship will be on my terms, or life will become very difficult for you. As long as you agree with everything I say at all times, we will get along just fine. Should you have a different opinion, then please keep it to yourself. In all likelihood, it's misguided. And you almost feel like you have a briefing about not saying anything that's out of line. Probably, if you're finding issues, there's probably a reason, or you haven't completely understood the creative idea. You haven't understood the premise. You haven't understood the dynamic of this idea. You haven't understood how it's going to work. And it's a complete sort of straitjacket on the researcher. And if only this relationship had started in a different place. So really what I want to say in terms of building this relationship, and I guess I'm talking particularly from a global perspective, because we spend, or certainly I spend a lot of time on global brands, on cross-cultural issues. I feel as though often we're using ideas that are at an executional stage to uncover some quite fundamental cultural connection issues. And that's soul destroying. It's soul destroying for everybody. It's soul destroying for you, because you can see executions literally, they feel like they're being ripped apart. You feel like all that's happening all the time is that doesn't work, I don't like that, I'm not getting that, I'm not connecting with that. Now, the reason that's happening is probably because there wasn't sufficient understanding of maybe the whole idea and how that has, whether that has cultural resonance, and how you would activate that idea in different cultural contexts prior to going into campaign thinking. That also allows you to say, do you know what, we've got very little chance of having the same executions working across these, whatever it is, 7 markets, because there's very specific reasons why you would have to execute this differently in these markets. And therefore, we're not going in trying to have like one campaign. We're allowed to say, we're probably going to need some different expressions of this core idea in different markets. And that's a so much more constructive conversation to be having. And I think there are enlightened clients who are coming and saying, do you know what, first of all, we want to understand the cultural map of this space. We understand what that means in these different spaces before we go launching in to let's thinking about communication and advertising. And I feel like if we were forming our relationships in those phases, we would have so much stronger partnerships, because the pressure would be off. The spirit would be, I actually want to understand. I really need to understand, because that's actually what's going to lead to some great work. For the insight agency, using semiotics, using cultural intelligence, yes, using consumer insight, but there are so many other things at our disposal. It isn't just about rushing out to India and China and running some group discussions. The world has moved on. You know, that you can learn together. It's a kind of exciting process rather than a soul-destroying process. And I think we need to recover a little bit of the values of curiosity and interest and fascination and looking for that unlock that goes, wow, it's just a different way of looking at this. It's a different perception. Maybe, you know, it can be about, do you know what, we've got to break the norms of the category. Well, you have to understand what the norms of the category are before you can break them. And actually the norms can be very different in different places. Let's understand them. Let's think about how we break them. Let's think about how we move on. So I guess my big plea is about, you know, we've kind of got a relationship that's foundering a little bit because it's got no space to breathe. And yet it should be so powerful. And I think at the moment it should be more powerful than ever. And certainly if you're working on global brands, it should be more powerful than ever. And it does concern me that we're entering into conversations on some amazing creative ideas, of thoughts, of inspirations, and having these discussions around them. But they're not going to be running in the UK, or the UK is going to be a very, very insignificant market in the grand scheme of things. You know, we need to be thinking about India, or we need to be thinking, or whatever it is. It varies, obviously, it varies by brand. And the thing that worries me most, and I guess is kind of my plea to, especially maybe people that are coming into planning more recently, is you have to want to understand about these different markets. You have to open your minds to how a different cultural dynamic will be in operation. If you're going in, and it's partly the position you are put in, because the point at which the research is brought in, and sometimes the client has imposed the research company on you, and you're a kind of unwilling, slightly recalcitrant teenager kind of saying, well, I'm here, but I'm not really going to take part. But actually you have to want to learn. You have to have an eagerness, an excitement, an interest, those kinds of values. I think that's what we need to recover, and I know that they have to come in at the right point in the process. But there's a world of insight, cultural context. There's a lot of different approaches are on offer, and I think they can unlock some great ideas, but they have to come at the right point in the process, a point in the process when you're able to enjoy learning, the agency is able to partner, and there can be a real quality conversation. I mean, the best pieces of work, if I think back to the most positive collaborations, it's been a fantastic three-way dynamic between client, agency and planner, and research agency. And that positive dynamic is not in evidence on enough occasions. And I think for both parties, we need to try and recover that. And then I think we have a happy future together. Thank you.
So maybe Wendy, John, and Kirsty would like to come back onto the stage and answer some questions. Normally what happens at this stage is I say, has anyone got any questions? And then nobody has any questions for ages. And then we have this awkward silence. So I have a question this time. So I will begin. And while I begin with my question and they're answering, you can all think of yours. And then the whole thing will get moving a lot more quickly. I was struck, Kirsty, by one of the things you were saying towards the end about the role of clients. And certainly in my recent experience, when I think back to when I started kind of 20 years ago, agencies themselves were commissioning a lot more of the research because there weren't these people called insight directors, and research in client organizations hadn't been professionalized to the degree that it has now. And we're often in situations where we'd love to have the kind of partnership that you describe with the research company, but we are actually formally forbidden from doing so by an insight director. sometimes we go around the edges and sort of say, can we have an informal chat about developing the stimulus material? And sometimes the research companies say, yeah, come in. And other times they go, oh, are you kidding? I'll be fired. And sometimes we have to have like a kind of chaperoned conversation, like a kind of Victorian suitor. What do all of you guys think about the role that the client is playing as kind of the third person in this relationship now?
It's rather crowded in this relationship. It's difficult. I couldn't say everything within that 20 minutes, but it was something that I wanted to talk about. I do think that it is incumbent on the researcher within that context to try and bring the planner in as much as possible and to demonstrate to the client that it's a good thing and that we can work productively and constructively together, and that's a much, much better place to be in rather than being forbidden to speak. So I try, and certainly personally, I try and speak up and say, no, actually we want to involve the planner in those conversations. And actually, we want to, especially if you're looking at creative ideas, it's awful when you haven't had a proper briefing on the creative idea. You're almost sort of, that sort of vicarious experience of a creative idea where it's like, you only experience it via the stimulus material. And you're kind of like, it is stimulus material to help us explore an idea, and it would be really good to get the full understanding of the idea. So I think we have to stand up. I think we have to say to clients, no, that should be a positive, productive, positive relationship. We do want to have those conversations, and we want everybody taking part. But some clients, sadly, are trying to almost create a distance as if we're sort of like enemies. And that's awful. And it's really destructive and dangerous.
John, Wendy?
You go ahead.
I think Kirsty's pretty much said what I would say. And I think, it's exacerbated by things like procurement. Which we suffer from. And, by the time actually, you have had some sort of dialogue initially, and it does, and then all of a sudden everything gets pared away, and you can't do this, and it's too expensive, and that, and that, and that, and the other. Everybody is sort of, the relationship is absolutely contaminated in that sort of way. And I don't think there's any other way except to stand up. I mean, you guys have got to stand up for wanting to speak to us, to your clients. And we've got to stand up for it as well. It's going to require both in unison.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And things like, demanding the creative, it would be good to see the creative brief. It would be good to understand those kinds of things, which I know seem very self-evident, but actually it is an issue. It is an issue with commissioning clients.
Yeah.
I mean, one way of breaking the deadlock, the adversarial relationship here is really between the insight person and the agency, regarding the agency as dangerous lunatics who, given half a chance, will do unspeakable things. They can't actually say what they are, but they will be unspeakable. And therefore, the research agency is put in a very difficult situation by that. And one way of just working with this is to solve the insight director's problem, which is that they themselves are quite isolated, and how do you help them to say, we can give you good stuff inside the organization, and frankly, an ad agency working with the insight director can actually make what they're doing a lot more interesting. They are slinging PowerPoints around client organizations and trying to interest people. It's a horrible job, and I think we can help them with that. So,
great. So, questions from the floor. Who has something that they would like to ask our eminent speakers? Well, there's a mic on its way. Ooh, hold on a moment. We like to make Sarah work for a living this evening.
One basic question. Why have you actually been focusing on creative development so much when Kirsty was saying it's getting in early and working together that matters? And isn't that part of where the relationships form from?
So why have I talked about creative development?
Why has it been the focus for all of you?
Well, I thought it wasn't actually. That my point was, which is why I used the CDP example, that it was actually about being able to say, maybe creative development doesn't matter so much, let's focus on product research, because that will tell us all the main things we need to know, which is why I spent as much time on hypothesizing as I did, because it just seems to me that it's not about taking creative development as this kind of universal sheep dip that everything has to be moved through, but by saying we can address those issues using other kinds of research and other aspects of the marketplace.
Yeah, and my point was, sadly, I feel like it dominates the researcher-planner relationship, and it's not helpful. It's not helpful for either party. So I think it's the reality of now, but I think we both want to move it to a different space where we can actually work together more productively.
And I think that that's why I talked about it, or inferred that that's what I was talking about, because, that's where the stress and tensions and, what I experience of where things are not coming out optimally are around those sorts of areas. I mean, like Kirsty, when you're at early stages, client, agency, and us are all much more open for learning. It's like when an agency is pitching as well.
Yes, I agree.
They're much more open for doing all sorts of different things, not spending any money at all, or spending something and doing something different. But as soon as it gets into that down the line bit, it's where it becomes stressful and things happen.
But I mean, you can do the simplest things. Is Elena here? No? Oh, she's there, right? Elena, I gave a bottle of champagne to because she was the only person I challenged for like 2 or 3 years, someone to do this, get the customers to write the ads. And nobody would do it. And Mark Earls was running Ogilvy's planning department at the time, and he wouldn't do it. And the idea was saying, well, if you want to do ads really cheaply, get the punters to do them. Because they're damn sight cheaper than the creative department. So you get them to do it. And then you basically say to the creative teams, you say, look at this shit. I mean, this is because what these guys will do is give you the language of the category, right? And they'll tell you all the cliches. And then you give that to the creative team and say, you better do something better than this. And of course, if you're doing it in a pitch, you then turn around and say, I hope none of the other agencies presented stuff like this because we did this at dirt cheap prices. And Mark wouldn't do it. And Elena, thank you, Elena, was the only person who did it. And they did it as a product. And we took that to the MRS conference 3 or 4 years ago. Why? Because sometimes it's useful to find out what the language of the category is so you can head away from it. And therefore, it isn't about needing to test the brilliance of the creative ideas that come out, because you already got those at rock bottom prices. It's just taking the same methods, but thinking a very different way about how you use them. But if you want to do that, call me.
Customers can do the ad strategy subtly beyond them. We're fine. Question at the back there?
Hi, there's maybe not so much a question, but a bit of understanding. So I'm somebody who's worked as a client and a researcher and as a planner. And I think I totally agree with doing more research earlier is, much more valuable to the whole process. And having worked in planning, over several years and more recently as well, I can see how the kind of qualitative research process isn't seen to come into the process at an early stage. The kind of paradigm that people are working to is bringing that in at a later stage, or possibly what I've seen is people hoping that it won't happen and therefore not wanting to initiate it earlier because, oh my God, that's going to be trouble and, an extra stage and everything. And then actually, oh, well, it does come in later. So, then it is the situation which Kirsty so accurately defined of this kind of frustration of people who just want to get on and make the ad, and then there's suddenly this big hurdle is put in their way. And I think one of the key things to kind of crack out of that, maybe unhelpful paradigm is for the planner to take this quite brave stance in terms of timing and when it would happen, and say to the team, and make this quite a big decision, with the directors on the account, we really think it would be better to get the insight in earlier and get the client on board with that idea as well, and all get the research, you guys, talking about how much more productive that will be, but making that quite a big decision, because it is for a lot of brands, a lot of accounts in advertising, from what I've seen, that would be a bit of a shift in the paradigm of what's happening, what they did before, what other brands are doing, etc. So I wouldn't underestimate the difficulty, the challenge to actually break that paradigm and do the stuff earlier rather than later. And I think that's where, John, your example there, it's a kind of paradigm shift, and I can see why you only got one person taking you up on it. It's because it's quite a dangerous, kind of risky thing to do. So that, from having my experience, I'd say it's something that you really need to kind of think about and address in a very serious way. And the planner needs to be, because they are sticking their neck out, getting as much support as they can for doing this, understanding that, bringing in all that cultural connectivity. And I'm a great fan of semiotics as well, which is really, really useful at many stages, late on as well as, but particularly early.
I mean, outside of pitch situations, have you got much experience of that where kind of planners or creative agencies are kind of initiating executional research rather than doing it slightly under sufferance because the client wants it done?
There's a lot more freedom then, I'd say, in the pitch situation.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Because you haven't, it's more condensed as well, the whole process. And it's not like, oh, well, the client doesn't want to do research at this stage, or, we haven't done it. And it also may be a category or an area where the agency hasn't got as much knowledge, so they need to, fast track that knowledge coming in at an early stage.
I mean, I think I have, but more when you've got to a point where there's real excitement and buy-in around an idea or a campaign idea or a brand idea, and then there's a genuine desire to know how to execute it powerfully in different markets, and then there can be real engagement in the process. But it's not a testing mentality. I think that's the thing. It's a developmental process. It's a sort of exciting journey rather than a sort of awful, testing process. So yes, but it's more the exception than the norm. I mean, the other thing I would say just on this earlier in the process thing, I'd really say I don't think that's just about consumer research. I don't think by talking directly to consumers we get all their answers. I think that there are so many more interesting, clever things we can do. I mean, semiotics being one of them, expert perspectives, observation, there are so many things now at our disposal. It's not just about saying, we do 6 group discussions, we're going to move that earlier in the process. It's really not that. It's about thinking very differently about what the world of insight is all about. It's consumer insight, cultural insight. It's understanding the sort of social changes, behavioral dynamics. It's a lot of different factors coming in to create a picture where you understand how your idea might work and how it will actually gain traction.
I also think, though, in creative development work, the standard thing is to go through spontaneous responses, what's the main message, what are the associations with the brand, how's this, this whole long list of stuff. Whereas actually, I mean, in the same way that Kirsty was talking about the early stages, they're very, very different ways of doing creative development research, which is about trying to tap into the immediate emotional response, doing very short things, lots of them, quickly, not getting tied up in all that long, hour interview for a 30-second stuff. And you don't see a lot of that. It's still the same old bog standard for group discussions or individual interviews. And it's as mad as,
it is mad.
In this day and age to be using that sort of model when I said earlier, that we know so much more about everything from cultural insight to linguistic analysis, whatever.
I mean, a lot of this the kind of developmental stuff, the way it always used to be done is keeping it in the family. Namely, you do it yourselves, and that's always the cut-off point of saying, well, no, we can't possibly spend the agent's money on that because that'll cost. Buying a whole research agency feels very expensive. And then if no one's available or no one knows how to do it, then it just stalls and nothing happens. So I guess one of the things to think about is whether you'd use someone from an agency as a workshopper. So therefore, you're using the workshop as a way of getting people's thinking going because you're fed up with brainstorms being almost the same way each time, and you've all taken turns at doing it, and we all know everyone else's different style. Come on, guys, let's do something else. How many people know about the IDEO card set? You know about that? How many people have got that as an app on their machines, on iOS? Anyone know about that? Show of hands? A few of you. Okay. IDEO, I bought mine from San Francisco. $50 or something ridiculous from one store over in San Francisco, mail order, whatever. And then they put it on an iPhone, iPad, whatever. It costs like £5. And it's basically their credentials, presentations about how to do people-based research. So if you're getting stuck and you want to do some developmental stuff, just get the IDEO card set, have a session, decide which techniques you're going to use, and just go and play with it. Because the main cost is to your time. And if you simply want to put that within the context of a workshop, one could do that at the end of the process or at the start of the process, divvying up the tasks, giving people jobs like that. But the IDEO card set is utterly, utterly brilliant of just giving you, in one simple app, all these ideas for person-centered research, which in part we've referred to, but there's about 30 or 40 different techniques. And I've got it on my iPad here, so I can show you after.
Brilliant. Next question, Dan. So. pacing along with the mic.
I can shout.
Yeah, but then it won't be on the video, no matter how loud you shout. The words are there for posterity.
Pass it along.
Oh, relay mic. Here we go. Nearly there. Lovely.
I was interested, Kirsty, you were saying that there are some senior clients who are commissioning amazing work. And to me, that sounds like an opportunity or perhaps something we can learn from. Why do you think they're doing that? What's motivating them? And can we steal some of that motivation somehow or use that to influence other clients or colleagues?
I think that our most exciting work is not being commissioned by the insight directors. She hesitates to say this.
I'm sure there are some in the room. I'm sure.
I mean, that's not exclusively true, but I think that often it's innovation. People concerned with innovation, so innovation directors with a brief around innovation, or marketing directors who are being given responsibility. I do keep talking global because it's my world, but they have responsibility for brands in these diverse places, and they actually feel quite vulnerable. They have relatively little maybe understanding or direct experience of, and so they're incredibly open. And they're also aware that they've got very ambitious growth targets often for their brands in these places, and they need something a bit breakthrough. They need something new. They need a fresh perspective, and it makes them bolder. It makes them braver. It makes them say, I want 5 provocations. I don't want a debrief. I want an inspiration piece. I don't want a, here's the state of the nation. And also they seem to have budgets. Budgets that are not sitting within the insight budget. They're taking it out of their marketing budget, their innovation budget, and within those budgets it doesn't seem such a major investment. And they'll partner with you really closely. They'll take an active interest in it, but not in a process sense, not in a exactly how are you going to do that and which 5 questions you're going to ask, much more in an output sense, much more in what am I going to learn from that? Could we add in this? I've just read this. What did you think of this point of view? How could we bring this in? And again, I've talked a lot about conversation. I feel like it's so much about quality conversations that take you along and inspire you along the way. And I would say, my experience is that largely planners aren't being included in those projects. They're happening directly without the planner. And actually, I'm having a bit of an issue with that because often you go along the way and then they suddenly say, oh, we better share these findings with the planner. And of course, the poor planner comes in, haven't been involved in the thing at all. It's difficult. It's difficult. You immediately, you can see people pulling back and thinking, I wasn't involved in this, I haven't contributed to it, sorry.
Yeah.
Just bang my microphone.
I mean, I agree. And it's not just in a global context. I mean, the experiences we've had that were good was when a brand director, but there's certain contexts, you know, if the brand's stuck and you don't know where to go, that's an opportunity to sort of go for fresh thinking, to try and do something different. It's not going to be every sort of problem that you've got. But it does cause problems because what happens is that whether it's the brand director or the marketing director, they have to bypass the insight director. And then you're dealing with a whole lot of shit that's going on between the two of them as well, you know. So.
True.
We've moved from a situation where sometimes there wasn't a research manager in a company at all, and any research that was done by a marketing person. Somebody wasn't even a marketing person. So there was someone who was a sales director. I mean, I'm talking ages ago, long before I was born, but that's where we've moved from. Now, the idea of research has professionalized itself, and the insight director represents that. But what we've basically got is the democratization of market research. And just about, I mean, the number, SurveyMonkey is amazing, isn't it? Think of the number of people in client companies who are using SurveyMonkey one way or another, and we don't even know anything about it. In other words, the idea that one should be customer-driven, that customer response, which is a radical idea which drove agencies in this country for the last 50 years, is now accepted as a commonplace everywhere. No politician would dream of doing anything without demonstrating that there is, the customer is somehow involved, and so on. So on that basis, we should be doing far more to find other people in the organization who are using customer input, who are customer facing and so on. They're there, but the insight team don't know about them. And part of our job is to find ways of getting into the business and meandering around. Top tips, store detectives, you work on retail. Store detectives are brilliant because they watch people all day. So they know what's happening in terms of who's buying what and all that stuff. They know more than just security, so that's useful. Always get into the call center to talk to the call center manager where people ring up to complain. Because marketing never knows about the complaints, almost never. But the call center people know about it all the time. And they are literally listening to thousands of conversations a day, and they're having status meetings. They know exactly what people think. So you've actually got to look for the information elsewhere in the organization. I don't really want to get into big data, but whether or not it's a good or a bad thing, the fact that organizations are sifting big data, usually in departments which marketing has very little to do with, is a massive opportunity for us. But instead of trying to control market research in some kind of little silo to do it properly, we need to recognize that the idea is so strong it's gone everywhere, and that if we know what we're doing with it, if we've got a craft skill with it, people will say, will you help me with this to do it better, because they'll actually appreciate what we've got to bring.
Okay, we probably have time for one more question. Anybody else? Oh, take the mic as far as it can go.
Yeah.
That's quite all right. There we go.
I come at this from a sort of actually insight directorate of client side.
Sorry.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm sure you're a good one.
But from having also run research agencies and also been a planner and various other things and in other countries and here. So I'm intrigued about this, and I think it's hugely important to get in early and build that relationship. I'm just wondering whether you feel that research agencies have the permission, the resource, and has the ability to get in early, and some of the things that you were talking about, John, getting into other parts of the organisation and finding those people and those avenues that may be open to you, but then allow you to come back into the sort of planner's fold. I just wondered if there's...
Well, I'll start with that one. I think researchers are very compliant, is my perception. They're good at doing as they're told and then explaining to you why they have to do it that way because that's the best way of doing it and so on. Planners are more unruly. And so therefore, my pitch would be that people who are doing research from a planning background tend to jump over the guide ropes and walk on the grass when they're not supposed to walk on the grass because you're looking for a break in the pattern, you're looking for something different. You need both because you can't, it's what people used to call gonzo planning, which was just going out there, finding something interesting, coming back in and saying, this changes everything. No, it doesn't. You just jumped over the rope and just stopped doing it. But the idea of saying we shouldn't be quite so compliant, and the difficulty, because the research product is under pressure in terms of margins, and so it does have a beginning and a middle and an end. And yes, of course, research agencies want to have ongoing relationships. Yes, they do pick up the phone and say, this is what we did in March, we should talk about something in July or October, and that's terrific. But there's still also thinking outside of the box, and I still think that is what planners continue to do. I hope we're still doing, and that is an important part of the equation. But that's a reason for planning departments being involved with insight departments.
Any other thoughts or views on the point?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, I feel as though clients are encouraging, certain clients are encouraging us to look in different areas, in different spaces and in different ways for some ideas, for some insight, for some fresh inspiration. And the best clients are less hidebound by tradition and traditional boundaries. I mean, I personally am struggling, I didn't talk about this today, but I slightly struggle with the term market research. And certainly our clients in the US are actively saying, don't ever call yourself a researcher, because it's a problem. It puts you into a box that you're a facilitator rather than a thinker and driving ideas forward. So in some ways, I think clients are encouraging more freedom and flexibility about who you speak to and how you do it, and come up with some different ideas. Yeah. But I'm not sure, I think it depends on the client and it depends on the discipline within which they sit within an agency. But I don't think planners are doing that. And I think that planners, you often quite like to keep us in our place.
Good note to end on.
Wendy can testify that I'm different. Would you like the last word on that one?
No, I'm done.
Okay, well, we'll have to draw to a close now, partly because I have some scripts in research for the case you're having this evening. It's not going brilliantly. I've got to go home and work out how I can rubbish the methodology in order to make sure that the client doesn't pay any attention to all of the downsides of the work in Paris. I'm sure it'll be fine. The creative did send me an email whilst we were here when I said, oh, the research apparently isn't going brilliantly well. Methodology's perfect. It's the content that's there. And he said, oh, I heard that other ad that we made the other day that's been really successful in market. That didn't research well in groups either. So maybe if we tell the client that, everything will be invalid. And unfortunately, that's not the case. So just to draw to a close, this is one of many APG events that we have. So if you've come along and you're not a member and you had to pay on the door, just imagine how great your life could be if this had been free. And then there are also loads of incredible things that you don't know about. But if you want to know about those, do speak to Sarah after APG membership. Is of course a bargain now we're doing so much more for our members than we did prior to Sarah being chair. And Sarah now being director. A couple of other things. Noisy Thinking will be back. We're taking a little bit of a summer break, but we will back in September. Back in September. So we're giving ourselves a bit of a rest, but we'll come back then. The training course I mentioned earlier on the 10th and 11th of July about understanding data. So it's to do with research, albeit the quantitative side. There are still some places available. That's a fantastic one. Details on the website if you want to have a look at that. And I think that is it. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you again to Google, and thank you again to Flamingo for their continued sponsorship that makes this possible. So thank you for your questions.